So I'm going to start session number 2. Session number 2, the panel will be speaking about respecting rights while providing access to digitized content. The moderator for the panel is Melissa Adams. Melissa is a member of the Nisga'a Nation. She's also the librarian and archivist for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, a nonprofit organization representing and supporting First Nations in British Columbia. And a note to the speakers, I'm the timekeeper for this session, so please, I'm sitting at the corner of this second table here, so I'll be holding up cards, 5-minute, 3-minute, 1-minute, etc. cards along the way. So Melissa, I'll let you introduce the panelists.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Adams from the House of Whoops Wizin-Webilk of the Gitskat or Killerwell tribe of the Nisga'a Nation, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today. The first two speakers I'd like to call up and introduce are Sherry Stump and Belle Alphonse from the Coyote Nation, from the community of, they just told me this and I've forgotten already, I apologize, quelk. And so you can join us on the stage and they will be doing a little bit more of an introduction to themselves.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sherry Stump. Can you hear me? I'm with the Gletnco. That's sort of hard to pronounce if you're not from our area. That's also the English name is Anaham. I'm with the Saskatoon National Government. I'm the Language and Education Coordinator, and I've been with them for 6 years. Initially, I started working with them on a language project with the First Peoples Culture Council. At the time, the funding was the Language Authority Project. From there, I moved on into education. We have a Saskatoon Language Certificate program that we run through University of Northern British Columbia. I'm going to introduce my colleague here. This is Bella Alphonse.
Hi, I'm Bella Alphonse. I'm from Gletnco. That's the name of our community. It's like about 60 miles west of Williams Lake, and I work as a translator for our tribal council, the Coyote National Government.
We can move on to our next slide. The Saskatoon, also known as the River People, we reside in the Chilcotin by the Taseko and Fraser River. As salmon was their main food source, this is why we've been giving our name. Bella can talk about the abbreviation more.
The Coyote people, when broken down into Tseiko means river. Gwetin means people from. Thus, we are the people from the river that live along the river.
So the Saskatoon National Government consists of the following communities. So we have number 1, we have up here, you see our map is located in the Caribou-Chilcotin area. Our first community is Gletnco-Anaham, which is the largest community. Our second is Chidel-Del, which is Redstone. The third is Unisiteen, which is Stone. The fourth community is Honeyquitine, which is also Nemaya. The fifth community is Glesko-Tusi. The sixth community is Estilaw, Alexandria. In total, our whole nation covers over 3,000 people. We can move on to the next slide. So when we first started working with UBC, thanks to Sarah, we applied for the digitization grant. We have, and it's basically we had back in 1999 and 2001, we had a number of interviews, and this was our traditional use study overview. The TOS was implemented in 1999 and 2001, and the purpose of the traditional use study was to document historic and contemporary patterns of land use and occupancy of the Tsaiskutin people through one-on-one interviews. The TOS was also established to collect, map, and compile the data for land management and protection of traditional use sites, heritage sites, and areas of concern. The information is also used for cultural and educational programs and to preserve the Tsaiskutin language for living participants. Unfortunately, some of the elders that were interviewed during that time are no longer with us. I'll have Bella Alphonse talk a little bit more with a traditional use study overview, as she was one of the main ones that were interviewing our elders during that time.
When this first started, that would have been in around 1999, 2001. I was involved in this interview when it first started. I interviewed elders, and then today I am now not only transcribing it, I'm also translating it into English as well. And so sometimes it can be challenging because these are fluent speakers that we interviewed during that time. And some of them have high level of fluency, and sometimes it takes me longer to translate it into English.
This is just a photograph of some of our elders that we interviewed. Unfortunately, only two are still living with us today. The rest have passed on. But without our elders, our history is gone. So I'm going to talk about what we initially applied for with the UBC for with our project. So our overview and our objectives to complete were to digitize our cassettes, preserve and save on a TOS server, update our TOS database, transcribe, translate interviews from Tsaiskutin to English, create apps for an educational resource. Right now, we've completed all the objectives, and we continue to work on the translating and transcribing, and we are working on creating apps for educational resource. Our traditional use study team consists of, at the time, was Brooke Elbers. She's our digitization technician. She moved on to Victoria. We have Erin Plan, who replaced her, as well as Geraldine Charlie Boy. She's from one of our Tsaiskutin communities of Tsai Daldel, which is Redstone. She also moved on. We had Mary Ann Solomon replace her, who was one of our areas from Honeyquitine. And we have Shane Dawrich, who does our mapping. So this appears some statistics of our cassettes. For our first digitization technician, she was counting the cassette tapes just for one interview. So the numbers are off. I have to apologize. I didn't notice that until before I went up to do the presentation. So with her numbers, she was estimating over 700 per tape of interviews. But with Erin here, our second digitization, I guess it's just a matter of their style or how they wanted to count the numbers. But he was counting per side. So in the green, the correct number is 830 recorded tapes in Tsaiskutin per side. And in the yellow, the correct number is 429 in English, and in the gray, 171 for both. But the correct number here he had per side is 1,430. During this time, we also had some, like all our most of our TOS tapes consist of interviews, a few songs, some linguistic work, and recorded meetings. So during the training, we were able to take the digitization training thanks to Jerry Lawson and his team there. But this is just a snapshot of the software that we were able to access. We borrowed the equipment from UBC, and we were also able to purchase a second, and we have that within our office. So we had two going on at the same time. When Brooke was working with us before she left, she managed to digitize all our cassette tapes. The next one is our audio release forum. You have a copy of that in your folders. Since 1999 and 2001, the initial release form was simplified. It was only one page. And since we started working back within the traditional use study and completing new interviews in 2014, we revamped this numerous times. We sat with our team. We went through we trying to go through the correct permission with our leadership and saying, how do we go about this? So what you have in your package is 3 pages long. I think what you need to keep in mind is making sure that you know what the interview is being interviewed for, this traditional use study purpose, how we plan on storing the information, what is going to be released, and asking their permission. So we have 3 boxes that are ticked off for educational purposes, if they want it to be publicly available, and that's on our website, or if we want to create any material. And they also have the option of none of the above if they want to keep it confidential. But the second page of the release form is just other information. And we actually have someone interpret it in Saskatoon if they don't understand. We help them go through this and have a witness and sign off on that as well. And we thought we were done with this 2 pages later, and we brought it back to our leadership at the chief's table, and they said we should add a disclaimer of liability. So seeking our legal counsel, he gave us feedback and stated that this is what we should include, so we added another paragraph. And for TNG staff only, we need to keep track of our PIN numbers of each of the cassette tapes, so that's for our own use, whatever is in the box there. I don't know if you want to add any more to the release form, or that's good. So we were fortunate that when we started working on our TUS, Brooke Elbers also came across that we had a number of tapes that were were at the museum, the Royal BC Museum. There are like 50 tapes, and she was able to access, we were able to get those copies back. And the Coyote song was recorded on a wax cylinder in 1915 in Spence's Bridge and was returned to the Saskatoon National Government by the Royal BC Museum in 2015, exactly 100 years later. Since the song was returned, Chief Roger of Honeyquitine, Youth Pierre Lassis of Glasgow, and Councillor Loretta Williams of Honeyquitine have learned the song. Attached is a video of the version, but do you want to include more of that?
This song that they got back, one of the songs that came back from the museum is regarding a coyote Coyotes in our language is quelk, and coyote is a messenger. In the song, the coyote is very sad. So coyotes are messengers. They are, I guess, deliverers of bad news, and they're simply giving you a message. And that's what that song is about that came back from the museum. That's the one Chief Roger William and a youth, PLSCs, they did an awesome job of singing that song. So it was very special to us.
I guess when they first sang this song out in Honeyquitine, it was during the winter, so there was still snow on the ground. But this is the first time they sang it, and after they came out of the building, the band office, there was coyotes singing. So they said that was quite powerful, and even our lawyer was quite impressed by what just happened and what he witnessed after they sang the song. So I will share the song. I think there's a video clip that we can click on. Were you able to hear that? Okay. I guess before we end, Bella will have a few more words here.
Some of these tapes that came back from the museum, we had elders in there that were speaking at a very high level of fluency. So for someone like me, I am fluent, but it took me a little bit longer to transcribe these stories. And the hard part was when I was translating them, I had to keep going back to elders that are still living today in order to translate it into English. And it had such awesome, it was such an awesome tape. This one elder that I did, and it's one of my favorites, he got asked one question at the start, and it took him 47 minutes later, he was still talking, and the tape ended. So it was very awesome, and usually it takes me one day to translate a 47-minute tape into English, but on his interview, it took me 5 days to finally finish it. So we were very grateful to get these back from the museum. Thank you. Sachanatya.
Thank you so much for sharing that and your experiences and everything you've discovered along the way, and also the story about the coyote. I like the lawyer reaction to it, too. I'd like to call Dave Shape up next, and he will be presenting once I pull up his bio here. He's worked since 1997 for the Stolo Nation, where he's the Director of Stolo Research and Resource Management at the Research and Resource Management Center, as the General Manager of Treaty Operations and a negotiation team member for the Stolo Treaty Table. And there he's involved with archaeology, heritage, landscape management, repatriation, cultural tourism, and curriculum development. And I think we can do some... we figure this out. Oh, there. And I will flip this microphone around.
Thank you. And I'm just going to sit here so I can see what's in front of me instead of looking over my shoulder. I tend to go by visual cues. I just want to begin by saying thank you to all the organizers of this excellent forum for putting it on and for inviting me to participate. It's a great opportunity, and appreciate being here once again on Musqueam unceded lands. And likewise, as others have expressed, really appreciate any opportunity to hear our elder Larry Grant open these types of events with his sharing of his wisdom. I'm going to talk today about our experience, a part of our experience at Stalo Nation, which is just upriver, the upriver Halkomelem speaking peoples of Elma and Stalo. Our experience at Stalo with regard to digital information, digital data, which includes a range of experience from library and archives to genealogies, and otherwise what I'm going to focus on today, which is heritage-based information and what we've come to create as a Stalo Heritage Database, which, as you see in the title to this presentation, is a factor of representing cultural landscapes by way of digital data. When you look around and you see where we are in Lower Mainland, we're sitting here in the western end of South Tamuk, and I think if you listen closely to Larry Grant this morning, he did mention that word South Tamuk, and it's our world, it's our land. It's the Lower Fraser River watershed in English. It's this territory here. What do you see when you're looking at this image? What's being represented to you? And in this image, do you see Stalo Coast Salish peoples? Do you see their landscape? We find that typically the vast majority of people out there in the world see something recognizable to them and their historical, cultural backgrounds, but they oftentimes are oblivious to a Stalo Coast Salish landscape in which they live. And part of the theme to this session is respecting rights while providing access to digital content. So if you don't know something's there, it's difficult to respect the rights of the people who live here, maintain long-standing traditions of knowledge, holding, sharing, and privilege, and who maintain long-standing, deep-rooted connections to the land and the resources for purposes of practice, of embedded knowledge, maintaining an archive in the land of important information, and require maintenance of that landscape in order to maintain a fundamental, what I would call cultural archive of information and knowledge that's housed in this landscape, this cultural landscape that surrounds us. We need to be respectful of that. And it's appropriate to follow Chilcotin, who recently were recognized for the first time ever in Canada for title to the land. And I think that's the ultimate respect for rights that we're talking about here in this context. We're looking at it from that regard, from the outside as well as from the inside. And the need to represent the land, the cultural landscape in a way that people can recognize so that rights that exist there can be respected. And when so the question is, how do we do this? We have over the years mapped things that are, in this case, Shwokweam, an aspect of history that goes back to the distant past and accounts for transformation places, Iaqtha places. As you drive through the land in the Central Fraser Valley, you notice Thiethel Cay and Squamay, two key mountain peaks that look out over the Central Fraser Valley that are in fact Shwokweam places. There's Slalacom places. They're all intangible in a way, and yet are manifest in the land and take form. They're supernatural beings, so to speak, that inhabit certain parts of the land and require attendance and attention to maintain their habitat, so to speak. Shwaikway, again, Larry mentioned representation of Shwaikway in the raven figure in the pole behind us. There's an image here. It's a Skokiel, old Skokiel band hall of a Shwaikway masked dancer. Information associated with that, again, highly privileged. All of what I'm showing you has different degrees of caretaking, of ownership, and privilege in terms of access. And Shwaikway is one of those areas that is, I would say, the most that and winter dance, but Shwaikway in particular, probably the most privileged set of knowledge that's housed within Staloko Salish people. And yet, most important to protect, one of those very most important, very sacred and most important aspects of the culture to protect, that does again require linkages to the landscape. So Alma, water babies, inhabit certain places throughout the territory. This is Chilliwack Lake at the upper end of the Chilliwack River Valley. And Smithla, again, something that we rarely are able to talk about or even know much about unless you're an initiate into winter dance. Everything I'm showing you is public and has been approved for presentation purposes. There's lots of stuff that I won't show you. But end of the day, these are all things that are necessary to respect. And so we've focused on digitizing, in a sense, collecting this information through what others have talked about, traditional youth studies going back to the late 90s, talking to elders going back to the 1970s with the collection of place names data. And then ultimately, in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, looking at translating written or recorded records into digital forms within geographic information systems. And some time ago, I wrote this piece that was sort of set out a framework of saying, well, we need some kind of common language to convey this information and to be able to share within the protocols of sharing that are established within this Stalo society. And GIS is a common language to be able to do that. And we kind of moved that direction in the manner of warehousing this information, taking care of it, organizing it, and bringing it together from various sets of data that existed, place names, warehouse here, archaeological sites information here, traditional use information here. Over the past 5 years or so, we've converged that into a Stalo heritage database, which is brought, harmonized, centralized, and which allows us to draw from in representing the Stalo cultural landscapes. And I'll use the term here, huilitum, as well. So the idea is that let's use this information as a means of creating awareness and providing a representation of Stalo peoples, relations to the land, and able to compare that and relate it to huilitum, our Western society, provincial and federal and so on, authorities and otherwise also invisible landscapes, to merge them, represent that as well, and put them together to see what that relationship actually is, which is otherwise quite invisible to us. And that's been our direction and our efforts over the past, really quite 5 to 10 years. And so I'll flip through a few of these they're maps. They come across commonly as maps, but beyond the maps are the digital warehouse that allow us to represent these features of the land in various ways. So, Shwokwayan places within Sa'altamuk. Chacha places, these are largely Stlalakum places within Sa'altamuk. These are archaeological sites or housings of belongings within Sa'altamuk, containers of knowledge. These are place names within Sa'altamuk. And again, looking at this, place names, how many place names do you know? How many places that are named do you know that are actually little points like that? Very few. There are some very small sites, but in large part, we've been working to get them in the system, and also then to render them in terms of an accurate area, a polygon, which in itself carries a fair bit of challenge and requires really deep thinking. And if you're doing this maintenance of your records and methodologies, is the metadata that's extremely important to leave a track record of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it for those who are coming after you. And place names are very much a challenge this way, but necessary to represent in order to apply in the manner that we're speaking of. Hunting, harvesting places, terrestrial harvesting. fishing sites. And so again, going back to the range of rights that we're respecting here, it ranges from the individual. Individuals within Stalo society have rights to particular places, maintain property rights that are transferred through time and through familial lines and through names. So it ranges from the individual to families to broader collectives. And ultimately, when you put this all together, you're looking at a Stalo collective, quelk of the people of the world, representation of aspects of the cultural landscape. And this is only part of that picture. That needs to be respected, and in which we use this digital data to represent in this manner. Okay, so you look at this and you know, what is that? Well, it's really a representation of digital information that can be used to protect these places, take care of them when their pressures come from the outside world. It's a curriculum. Others have mentioned the use of this information for educational purposes. Absolutely. It's the value that you're seeing here in the representation of knowledge that's transferred into a digital form that allows us to really add value to this and use this information in useful ways that are ways most useful to the community as they see fit. But ultimately, again, in respect of the need to do this for the collective rights that exist, but also understanding and necessarily understanding the rights of the knowledge holders who have provided this information throughout all of these years, which is, I think, one of our earlier presenters mentioned, sometimes can be challenging in the context of the community itself, when privileged information about spiritual practice areas like bathing sites or places where people are putting their regalia out into the forest for protection, not to be touched, not to be interacted with, confidential information in a sense. That information is provided to us for particular purposes of protection, but not to be provided to other community members. So when folks are asking for it, we cannot divulge that information even within their own community because of the circumstances and limitations placed on that information as shared to us by the knowledge holders or the practitioners. And so you need to be true to that. Okay. And in bringing visibility and recognition and communicating all of this, we see it as a factor of moving through reconciliation. And let's get on the same page with the between societies here, establishing governmental relationships. This is a foundation to do that effectively, and we found that to be true. But it also raises a significant challenge as we continue to elevate our relationship with British Columbia, for example. So their crown lands, right, and their interests overlap substantially with that picture that I just showed you of Stalo lands and interests. And in order to reconcile those interests, potentially and often conflicting, you need to share the information in some manner. And so you move to build trust. It's really it allows the building of trust to have the access to the information to potentially share. But we find ourselves at a point as that relationship builds and grows and trust develops, there comes a time where we're going to have to, and necessarily for our benefit, share this information with the province, intergovernmental sharing. I think that's the next step, and we're very cautious in approaching that, and developing information sharing guidelines and so on, but to a common benefit of elevating this degree of recognition and respect for Stalo rights and title. And taking care of what belongs to us is a common saying, and that means taking care of the knowledge, taking care of the digital information as a means of taking care of the land and the resources and the people. Confidentiality, I question what that is. In our experience, what is it that is confidential? What does that word mean? Why are we using that word? And ultimately, if something is truly confidential, more than being you can have it, but use it with to a limited degree, or limit the access to it. We don't want it if it's confidential. That's personal information, should not come to us to include in our warehouse. Right? So I think we draw a distinction between confidentiality, meaning something that don't give to us, versus limited access and use for particular purposes. That's different. And I know that because of the pressures in the land and the pressures on the land and the people from this urban development here, moving eastward over time and continuing so, the massive pressures on the land and the resources, if you could see them, it's astounding to visualize as we can now, the provincial interests and the development interests on the land. It's phenomenal. Blew me away the first time we were able to manifest that digitally. The old way of keeping things secret does not work as an effective means of protecting places and people and sites. And so it causes us to reconsider that word confidential and to cause us to question and look into more deeply what it is that we need to do to take care of what belongs to us, and to reconsider what confidential means and where information can and should be shared and how it can be shared, going back to understanding why folks over the past 100 years have largely guarded information that's very important to them. And in certain cases that still works, in certain cases it doesn't. And so we're on the verge of a place where it doesn't work very well in many instances, and so it forces us to, as we build this information base, really address those points of protocols to access and use. Okay, so I'll keep it at that. I think we're still in time, or is there much time left? Lots of time left. Okay, then forget it. I'm going on. That says I'm done, but I'm not. Okay. Okay. Well. Yeah. We'll call it. I can go on and on, but I won't. And these, I'll just end with this slide here, which is, these are some of the aspects of relationships that are emerging these days and becoming points of discussion around this type of information and these questions, with strategic engagement agreements and consultation, accommodation processes, and shared decision making, all emerging out of this increasing recognition and respect of Indigenous rights and title as they exist still here in British Columbia and throughout Canada. So we're actively affecting this change, and all of what you're talking about here today is a part of that. So I'll say Lahai at this point. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Sure. No.
So joining us next will be Kate Hemsey, and I will just pull up her slides. Okay, yeah, one of them brings up the notes. Okay,
That's great. Thank you.
okay, I can do more of an introduction. Okay. And Kate will do more of an introduction of herself.
Okay. Can you hear me like that? Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank the organizers again for inviting me today. It's wonderful to be here, and also express my gratitude to be here on unceded Musqueam territory. So I teach at Simon Fraser University at the School of Interactive Arts and Technology in Surrey. And today I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I've been very fortunate to work on over the last decade or so. Both of the projects that I'm going to talk about were funded by the Virtual Museum of Canada, which is an initiative of the Department of Canadian Heritage to fund access to collections, museum collections in Canada online. But the two things I'm going to talk about that these projects that I've worked on have helped me and my collaborators to understand better is this notion of ownership and control, and some of those issues that come up in the course of producing virtual exhibits like these. I'm going to talk about two projects. The first is a project that was produced with the Doig River First Nation called Dane Wajich, Daneza Stories and Song, back in 2007. And Amber Riddington is a co-curator and co-producer of that project. She's here, which is wonderful, and going to talk about ongoing work later. So Amber, if there's anything you want to jump in and say, please go ahead. And also a project that will be released in the fall that's produced with Dave and the Scowlitz Indian Band and the Stolo Research and Resource Management Center called Scowlitz, a Stolo Coast Salish community in the Fraser River Valley. So it was about 10 years ago that Amber and I went up to the Doig River First Nation with an archive that had recently been digitized by Robin Riddington and Jillian Riddington, including a great deal of very valuable photographs, audio recordings, film recordings that they had recorded with Daneza communities over the last 40 years or so. And they, given the new tools available and their desire to return this material to the community in an accessible form, they created this archive. Amber and I were working with the community to develop and design a Virtual Museum of Canada exhibit. We didn't know what it would be about, but we did know that we wanted to find a way to create access to that archive and start to use it for a lot of the projects and goals that the band had at that time. Now, in this picture, we're sitting in the Doig River Band Hall. At the very beginning of the production process of this exhibit, the chief at that time, Gary Oker, had brought a Daneza Dreamer's drum from his house and had opened it up in the meeting as a way to facilitate conversation about what he thought that this exhibit might be about. And in this photograph here, I'm filming Tommy Atachi, who's talking about the drum in Daneza Zage, and he's telling the story of who made that drum, how it came to be created, where that drum had, where the dream that related to the image on that drum had been received by a dreamer named Gaïen, who had died a century before. After those initial meetings, we traveled, Amber and I, with a team of youth and elder filmmakers out to places in Daneza territory where people recorded stories about dreamers in Daneza Zage. Here you can see Robin Riddington and Chief Jerry Atachi, Mayup Sasson, and some of the youth participants out looking for some important places for the project. And we ended up recording these narratives in 7 different places in Daneza territory. Now, over about 2 subsequent years of virtual exhibit production, where Amber and I were traveling back and forth between Vancouver and Doig River to work on aspects of the site and bring it back for review and discussion, some really important questions started to come up as we got close to sort of the final version of the website. This is an image of workspace in the Doig River Band Hall where we were working through content for the exhibit. All of that material eventually became this project, Dane Wajit, Daneza Stories and Song, Dreamers in the Land. But in the course of doing this work, people started to talk about the fact that images of dreamers' drums, including the ones that were in the archive, were not suitable to be shared online. They weren't suitable to be shared publicly. Now, it was described how they were sacred and had always been managed under restricted conditions of access and viewing. So what I want to just highlight here is that we learned through this collaborative process of producing this exhibit that there was a very strong desire to control the circulation of the products of research that were in the archive, and also other kinds of heritage in digital form. And we also learned that this collaborative process of producing media opened up a really important space where people could articulate their local cultural property rights and how they thought that material should be safely and respectfully circulated. And I think Amber will agree, if this hadn't been a longer process of review and discussion, maybe those rights wouldn't have been articulated in that way. Again, though, even though those claims could be made and decisions could be made about how the material circulated, we kind of came up against this ethical paradox where, while the process that we were engaged in opened up a space to talk about what should be shared and what shouldn't, it actually, pointed to the fact that it can be pretty hard to enforce those rights. So even though there are images that people at that time didn't want to share, they were actually still available online, and it's hard to take back things that have been digitized and shared already. In the context of our project and also prior projects and publications and research. So now let's jump ahead to now and another Virtual Museum of Canada project that's being produced by the SRRMC. And Dave, please jump in too if you want to say anything. What I'm going to sort of say about this one is here we have similar questions and similar kinds of concerns about respectful circulation of cultural heritage, respectful circulation of information about the community, and how can that be done in a way that's respectful of rights and demonstrates ownership and control of this material. So this project is just in the final stages of production, a collaboration between the Scowlitz First Nation and the SRRMC. Is that okay if I abbreviate it like that? And then a really big team of archaeologists, anthropologists, media producers, and designers. And this project uses the Reciprocal Research Network as a central repository for bringing together the products of archaeological work in the Scowlitz community through field schools and other collaborative work over the last couple of decades. And so the site is intended to be a community biography and a representation of culture, language, and history here. And also a document of about 20 years of collaborative community-based archaeological work, which included the excavation of burial mounds and reburialed ancestors, building on what Dave has just been talking about in his presentation. In the course of doing this work, important cultural protocols were developed to make sure that people were protected in doing the work that they were doing, to make people visible to the spirits on the site. And this guided the way work has been done, and it's also been part of the way this virtual exhibit has been framed and the collaborative process has unfolded. Now, the belongings that came from the Scowlitz site or the Kithiel site obviously have a very real connection to the way people live today. So there's a very important sense of continuity that's developed and revealed in the process of making this material public. And of course the tools have changed, but what people are doing in many ways is the same. Here's Sonny Williams is cutting a salmon at his house, doing work that that of course is in continuity with what people are seeing in the Kithiel site. Now, Dave talked about quelk, and I just want to bring this back as one of the organizing principles for this virtual museum project. Belongings that this exhibit shows are also part of Stolo quelk, and on the site it's described as true news. It refers to the oral history of our ancestors and the places they fished, hunted, harvested, and spent time in our world. Once we know our quelk, we have a responsibility to use the places our ancestors used. Once we use these places, it becomes our responsibility to take care of them. Taking care of the places in our quelk means protecting them so they can provide for our future generations. So this project has been in large part about building connections between elders and youth in order to share quelk, but also to find a way, building on presentation, to share this as an outreach tool with the public, to share these stories with the community and to draw attention to this history and what it means for all of us in our colonial relationship. So the principle of quelk has been very important for the team in considering how documentation and photographs and material produced for this exhibit can be shared publicly. And one of the things that we have worked on is integrating traditional knowledge labels. Has this come up yet in the conference? So the Sustainable Heritage Network that I know is here, and the work of Kim Christian and Jane Anderson with localcontext.org has been to develop labels that are kind of like Creative Commons licenses that can be attached to media that indicate that this information needs to be considered differently from other kinds of information, that traditional knowledge has different attributes that need to be considered, and this is an opportunity to share this information and to instruct and inform the public about how this information should be shared. So building on our process, the community advisors and the group who's working on this project translated into Halkamelum certain types of labels that help people better understand how this information should be shared and used. So attribution, for example, refers to who produced the knowledge. In our Halkamelum language, we call this, I can't pronounce it very well, but squix kas te tamech, name and place. Scowlets is a tribe of Stolo, the holders and caretakers of the knowledge who look after what belongs to them. Similarly, Siwes, which means outreach, specifies that this knowledge is shared to educate other Stolo and non-Stolo about the teachings of this community. We call this Siwes, education or teachings. So these are a couple of the labels that are applied to the entire website as a way to indicate people's very deliberate sense of outreach, but also control and ownership of the material. And then there are other labels that Dave actually alluded to in his presentation. Haha, meaning that something is sacred or secret. So material that is not revealed but can be shown to be present and cared for respectfully is a part of this as well. So I won't go on much longer, but just to say that for both projects, I think these core concerns are still really, really central. This notion of controlling the products of research in your community. How can you share them in a way that integrates and communicates a local sense of what is ethical and proper for sharing? How can you have control of circulation of cultural heritage in digital form in a time when it's very easy to share and remix and circulate without that kind of control? And also in this project, that a longer process of collaborative production that involves very core community participation from the early point of writing grants and deciding what the project should be about and deciding how the process will unfold has been really important for creating a space in which these rights and cultural rights can become a really central part of the project. And I think the traditional knowledge labels are an example of a new tool that has come out of a lot of projects all over the world. And a lot of communities are also struggling to determine how best to represent their cultural heritage online while sharing it and also respecting what it means. So thank you very much. I will end it there. Yeah, thank you.
Does this mic come on? Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you very much, Kate, and also to Belle and Sherry and Dave for all that they've shared with us today. So we actually, is it 12:30 that we're due for lunch? So we have loads of time for questions, discussion. So what I might actually get you to do, Kate, is move over to the other table, and then I can run around with the microphone to anybody who has any questions. Yes, and I see one at the back. Sorry.
I have a couple of questions. One for the ladies up there, please, to the right there, my right. The translating of the language from the tapes that you're doing is really critical work. And your group is leading the legal battle on the ground to prove title. And we're also proud of you. And so all your stuff has to be court ready or court usable. And so is there some kind of group that has to give final approval to what you do, or do you receive that beforehand? And like, I mean, you kind of got the nod already that this is how it is, because I know from group to group things change pretty quickly with language, and things could mean different things. Like with our communities, just from Nanaimo to Cowichan, a word could change to mean a completely different thing. And so I guess, is there some kind of approval process in the end that says, okay, this is going to work, our lawyers can use it, or the elders approve of it, the community approves of it, or is it kind of on your shoulders right now?
Our approval process, even before we even are employed with our tribal council, we have a confidentiality form that we fill out that says we are able to work in this department, and all the 6 chiefs sign off on it. Anything that we release has to go through all our leadership. We have the 6 bands, so I mentioned the 6 chiefs, so they approve that. And if they are unsure, it goes through our lawyer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's hard. I know it's got to be real careful, walking on eggshells there. And the gentleman there, sir, you're talking about intellectual property and that idea about not sharing what you don't want shared. That sounds good, but it's really hard. I know, ochre, our red paint and what have you, is like where it's gathered is top secret, and it's such a critical mineral for our people, and only some people can find it from our communities, and where it's located, you don't want everybody there taking it. Some of the places to store or stash our regalia, where those places have been through centuries or what have you, and rock caves or things like that, and sacred plants that are used in different ceremonies, and our burial sites and what have you. I'm wondering, the government is pretty sticky right now about intellectual property and ownership of that, and are you working at your table to make side agreements with the different ministries or different departments and to somehow protect that information and access to that information?
It's a big question, absolutely. The intellectual properties issue relationships with, say, at treaty table is a serious challenge. And ultimately, in working through that at the Stalo table, it's come to realize the national system of intellectual properties is apples and oranges with what we're talking about for Stalo intellectual properties. And since they're immovable on their intellectual properties, we have to come up with creative terminology, ultimately, to call it something else, to make it clear that we're not talking about the same thing. We're not trying to move the national recognition of intellectual properties. We're trying to define and fill a space that's not within their recognition that can be used to apply for those purposes that you're talking about under the regime or framework of information control to protect places where tummuth is gathered, if that information can be provided and then set out for the purpose of use for protection as opposed to not provided at all. But we do play this in a number of realms, so there's a benefit in having, I think, a fairly fortunate position, even though it's a lot of work, is to have a foot in relationship to federal, provincial governments in terms of treaty, but also opportunities that exist in the bilateral relationships, as I mentioned, like reconciliation agreements and shared decision-making agreements, just with the province. And then the third realm, which is just apply it. You just do it. I think our basic premise is there's a process for negotiating. There's relationships that can be built around shared degrees of decision making. But ultimately, it's from the Stalo perspective, it's not a matter of question whether rights and title exist. They do. And so we just apply it. That's the occupying the field of this work that we're talking about here. So we kind of run across the spectrum there. And play it in these different fields. So it's a big question. It's a challenging one to answer briefly, but I hope that's of some help to your question.
And just one last question for the lady there on the left with songs. Our songs vary. Like we have people within our community, and some are called thethas. Like Ruby Peter from our community is a language specialist, and she's a thetha. And she can deal with ancestral remains and some sacred things like that. And there's other people who are recognized to have that inherent right within our community. And so our songs vary all the way from like bone game songs to individual spirit dancer songs to sacred songs that can make inanimate objects move and what have you within our big houses. And so the categorizing of that, then we have a huge collection of songs in the University of Washington archives and different universities like that, and sorting those out and sorting out who has, who should be poking around in that stuff or who should be, without someone with you or something like that. And even for protection, like Ruby warns all the time about these people don't know who you are, they don't know the language you're speaking, and you're coming in and here you are messing with their song or their words and what have you. And so I guess rules around that kind of stuff seem pretty important. So just wondering you have all that community support, I guess, with you as you venture into that kind of dark area.
I think one of the things that seems very promising about the traditional knowledge labels and their intention is that there's potential for community or community leaders or representatives to go into existing collections and potentially add labels to them as a way to indicate how they should be treated today. So there are labels, for example, they're in process, the development of these labels, but verified, for example, might be an ability or might indicate that a community today thinks that this is correct, what was recorded 100 years ago, right? But you might also go and see an ethnography that was written 100 years ago that is not correct from your perspective, so that would not be verified. Or something that has been published but is sacred, it's private, it shouldn't be shared. So to put a restricted label on it or a sacred label on it would be a way to go back and indicate how this should be treated today. So I see that as quite a powerful resource potentially. And Dave may want to speak to what that's meant for the Stolo project, but I've seen that as a powerful expression of control over what is being shared for the public with the goal of creating conversation and engaging in a process of reconciliation. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Oh, I was just going to follow up with this song. Question, Daneza people have two types of songs, Nachi Yene, which are dreamer songs, and then Ma Yene, which are personal medicine songs. And so the Nachi Yene are meant to be public, and so even though they do, the main audience for them is really a spirit, as well as other people, but they're still meant to be public, whereas, like Dave was saying, some people just don't, no one would ever let anyone record their personal medicine song. So for Daneza material, it makes it a lot easier because I don't know of any collections at all of personal medicine songs, because I've never heard of anyone sharing that publicly or agreeing to let it, people just wouldn't let it be recorded. So all the songs that exist are public already. It makes it a lot easier. It doesn't mean they're well contextualized always, and it doesn't mean you know a lot of information about them. So that information is very important to recontextualize it. But in terms of public, private, so in terms of, there's been a lot of dialogue about whether songs are group cultural property or individual cultural property, whether they should be based on the lineage of the dreamer who dreamed the song or not. And basically they've decided that well, they haven't decided. Their protocol is there's no protocol. The protocol is you deal with everything on an individual basis. So, so that's how you deal with their culture.
Other questions, comments?
Angie Bain, Union of BC Indian Chief in Tlakatma Nation, Lower Nicola Band. How do you handle projects that have sites that are shared with other nations or stories that are shared with other nations and decisions about access and putting them out there in the media that you choose? Do you go as a nation-to-nation, government-to-government? Do you sit down and talk to them the same way you would talk to the provincial government or the federal government? Because there's big implications on if your community is okay with sharing one site, but your neighboring community who also uses that site has issues. How do you reconcile that?
That's to me, I'd imagine. That's a big one too, yeah. I think that's part of, I would say, the current landscape of what First Nations in BC are really trying to achieve is work out the relationships between them. on, when we're talking government-to-government relationships, nation-to-nation relationships. That's been a topic of discussion, and I'd say that's something where there's a lot of room that a lot of work that needs to happen there. But I think we do our best to work at a community base in terms of the information we're gathering and warehousing, to talk to the people and those who are providing that information to be accurate to what we're given and to be true to the conditions that are set on the information. And so I'd say it's sort of a very organic individual or community-based foundation that then works itself up to more of a political level in terms of relationships nationally, governmentally, and those are things that need to be sorted out. And I would totally agree with that point, that the more we can do that, the better shape will be to have to build those relationships and be clear on the certainty or the foundation for the use of that information, in the best way possible. So work needs to be done there, absolutely. And I know that's on the horizon for sure.
Other discussion? Yes.
Hi, Peter Jacobs. Question about the use of language in, I only caught the last two talks, but the use of language in coming up with categories or ways of talking about the protocols. They have political implications. I'm just interested in the process of getting there, if you have information to talk about that. One of the questions I have is with the term true story, because it's kind of an anthropological description of two different types of stories in Coast Salish. So it's kind of, to me, it's still an imposed category from anthropology onto linguistics, onto the language. But I imagine there's been more discussion since then about those type of categories.
Yeah, this Scowlitz project that I talked about really wanted in its desire to communicate and to create outreach to the public, wanted to find a way to share a lot of information, and to tell a lot of different stories, and also to show the continuity of certain concepts in everyday life today. So one of the ways to do that was to divide this website up into 3 sections. So one is CWES about. Okay, this is everything about the project, its history, and so on. And then the other 2 concepts were Shwohuyam, the stories of long ago, before oral history, before Squelquel. So there's kind of 2 time periods and 2 ways of talking about information. Now, Squelquel includes things like what anthropologists have decided they know or what they think, what archaeologists have done, and the stories that have come out of those interactions as well. So yeah, I think that the creating categories has that feeling of maybe overly determining what something is. But I think this was a community-based process of deciding how to organize information so that it could be shared, and also so that those concepts could be shown as enduring. Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much right on in terms of Squelquel meaning true news. I mean, that's the information and the literal definition that was given from the elders back in the 70s. It's true news. That's our personal, and I think you can actually work off of that to understand more clearly what they meant when they were saying it's true news. Because, again, it's using this English to represent a Halkomelem word and concept. So, we've thought about that to try to understand what the elders were saying when they gave us that translation. But that's the root of it in any case.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, I said there was 2, but I think the true part comes also in relationship to gossip. So there's gossip stories, there's Squelquel, and there's Shwohuyam. So, but just the true part, I struggle with that sometimes because I don't think anybody's saying that Shwohuyam are not also true.
No, exactly.
Right. So that's I know that you're not saying that, but I think it could be misleading.
No, very good point. So the fact that we're saying that why are therefore Shwohuyam not true? Absolutely not the case. And it's I think again going back to something that that Larry Grant mentioned this morning. It's true news. It's facts. These are not to be changed. So it's not the gossipy stuff so much as your genealogies. These are the histories you need to know that are fundamental to determining who you are and your place in your family and your place of your family in the community and the society. So it's the true news. It's the factual news that people oftentimes will use in the basis of introducing themselves. And you hear that today, even in all the introductions today, a lot of the introductions. So it's that aspect of it, I think, is the focus. And clearly emphasized, Shulkoyam are true as well. That's a fact. So when we're saying this person's transformed into Tithlake and her dog in Squame, like those images I showed you, that happened. And that's fundamentally needs to be accepted, which is part of that occupation of the field. You don't need to rely on the province or the federal government saying, okay, no, that's a good thing, that's true, we agree with you. We're not. That kind of agreement. It's a matter of fact, and that's a matter of moving forward with that as a fundamental understanding. So good point.
Come over here.
Katwa Alap, Colleen Jacob, and Shkwachicha Statliamuch. My question is around intellectual property. And I guess it focuses around the research, like who does the research and who owns the information. Because I know in the past, it seemed like when people whoever produced the information almost became the ownership of that information. And sometimes it was hard even for us to access that information when it came to doing research. And so I'm just wondering where it's at right now, and I'm not sure who would answer the question, but say if researchers were doing a shared project, say even with UBC or any of the other universities that are working with the First Nations communities, I'm wondering if there's protocol in place where researchers sign a form now stating that when they do the research, in the end, who owns that information. So I guess I'm just wondering where, if you know where that stands at the moment.
That's a tough question, Colleen. With the Saskatoon National Government, we have 2 research projects right now, and one was with UNBC and another one with Simon Fraser University. So with Simon Fraser University, it's regarding their CERC project on the language revitalization. So that's a 7-year project, and what we have in place is a memorandum of agreement that we sign with them, and that goes through our executive director and our chiefs as well. But what can be shared right now, it's just with SFU and what we're working on with the project. So what we share, we probably won't share until after the project's over.
Something that was, I think, important in the virtual museum projects that I talked about today, and something that Amber and I have both, thought a lot about and worked on, is, different media have different copyright assigned to them, depending on when they were produced and by who, and what kind of agreements were in place at the time that the material was produced. So something that was a big part of the Doi River project was that the digital archive was returned to the community, but not necessarily the ownership of the media in it. So the person who recorded it legally had the rights to use it and felt, and maintained that right. And so that was one situation. And that helps to rethink what the protocol is for researchers in the future. And I think in general, now, in the Stolo project, for example, all the media and photographs and video that were recorded in that project belong to the Stolo Nation and the Skalitz Indian Band. So that was the agreement for that project going into it. So I think there's a transition from the Copyright Act that meant if you took the photograph, you became the copyright holder of that image, even if you had never built a relationship or even knew the person you were photographing. That was what the law has done and still can indicate. So I think those kinds of agreements at the beginning of a project and determining how the media produced will be owned and who will control it and what rights are associated with it or what kind of sharing of rights is assigned, that's really important to talk about at the outset to avoid those kinds of tensions. But they're real tensions and they exist, and I think it's really important to talk about them and have that conversation. I think it's been important for Doig River, who's really highly, highly valued that archive and continues to. It's very, very important. And finding a way to share authority going into the future is an important part of that.
I would totally agree with what was said. Extremely important. Don't even collect anything if you haven't got that squared away. That's that's, I would say, a fundamental stepping stone. That has to happen. It really should be first and foremost, because otherwise you leave that to later or make assumptions. It can be quite messy. I think that what Kate was saying, if Stalo Nation or the SRRMC tag themselves as the owners, it's only in a stewardship manner. We don't own anything. The information we collect is collected and maintained on behalf of the community, but according to the principles, or I would say, start with Snowaeth, again, laws of the land. There are copyright laws. There's all these laws that exist within a Stalo Helkamelum Holma framework. So we try our best to understand that and maintain things within the context of those laws and according to the details that are provided and limits provided by the individuals or the groups that have shared that information with us. So back to that development of those policies, the permission forms, and so on. Extremely important to think through those in detail, have those on the outset, and then before you move forward with collecting and then encountering all the other questions and obstacles and issues around storage and maintenance and so on. That's a really important first step.
Just a quick question. Just a warning that I mentioned the research I did in the 70s that got stored in collections in the University of Washington, and their policy was after 25 years or after I died, I lost ownership, and linguists were digging into it and want to co-author now. I said, okay, I was going to author, but I don't have all the technology and the speed to do technology. So with that awareness, I have begun to gather more youth to do their own, to have ownership by being the authors themselves. So to be authors and digitally aware and being able to do these things, so that we do not have specialists taking away the rights to their culture. Thank you.
Hi, Daisy Rosenblum, First Nations and Endangered Languages here at UBC. So all of you are talking about and actively involved in stewarding indigenous knowledge systems and local knowledge systems through digital media and technologies. And of course the digital media is sort of emergent from Eurocentric knowledge systems and reflects that. And so I'm interested in, I have a sort of theoretical question and a practical question. I'm interested in what the tools are that you're using. Are you using Makurtu? Are you custom building databases? And then also, how do you stretch those tools to accommodate the needs of the systems that you're stewarding within them?
Okay. I can start at least. And there's a variety of systems that we use. Library and Archives uses Past Perfect. It's a proprietary software that we've purchased and used for the purpose of maintaining that information and also incorporating our material collections into that set of that warehouse. A huge piece of the work and part of what I was talking about, didn't really show you, but the system for maintaining the Stalo Heritage Database and for manifesting those images and so on, and for incorporating information around provincial land use applications and so on and so forth. To make that whole thing work, it's a system we developed called Stalo Connect. And in fact, that was based on and working with the same developers, some of the same functionality and needs for communication systems, for bringing information out in a visual manner. It's not you don't need to be a GIS person to use it. It's a viewer, and GIS people input stuff into it. But anyway, it's based on our reciprocal research network and some of the same functionality. So I think we benefited from developing our own software with establishing a good, solid, long-term relationship with developers that we know and work with to continually modify the system. So Stalo Connect is then moved into the Cultural Sites Protection module, which is an offshoot piece of that, and it sort of continues to grow and evolve, but built on our needs through our own individual creation of that system in any case. And so we anticipate kind of continuing on in that manner. For those who are aware or want to know, that we create open source materials with encouraging others to take whatever they can of anything we're developing ourselves for use. So rather than, it's not proprietary on our part, but we find greats have really appreciated and benefited from that ability to make your own stuff. Guys, anything?
I think the Virtual Museum of Canada projects are by default public. There's nothing on them that can't be shared publicly, and that's been part of the process of curating and selecting the information that's shared on them. But I do think the labels are one way to kind of adapt and make a kind of strong articulation of ownership, and that this knowledge is a particular kind of knowledge being shared that's different from other Virtual Museum of Canada projects. So access to localcontext.org, which emerged out of the Mukuru, and the sort of investigations there, or kind of experimentations there around assigning and indicating different forms of ownership and ways of respecting material, is what has influenced that project. So it's a public project, but it tries to show awareness that this is a different kind of story being told.
Other questions or comments?
I'm not sure if we've actually covered this at this session or if everybody knows, but Dave, what is the RRN?
The RRN, what's the SRMC? What's the RRN is the Reciprocal Research Network, and that's that system that was developed as part of the Partnership of Peoples project here at UBC, Lab of Archaeology, Museum of Anthropology, Musqueam First Nation, Stalo Nation Tribal Council, and Umistic Cultural Society. Really putting that together in that 5-year period between 2005, launching in 2010. And it's a system that was developed to bring together information held in museum collections from 13 partner institutions in the United States, Canada, and Europe. And now that's blossomed. So it has a whole bunch of functionality that to bring all this stuff together in one point of access, allow you to create project spaces, distinguish or create dialogue with communities from where these materials and belongings come from. So it's interactive in that regard, and you can set standards or limitations on access in terms of your own private project spaces. So it allows for administration of things like that, and where you can set your levels of access according to whether it's you or your family or an academic project or whatever it may be. That's sort of a quick rundown of what the RRN is, and I think we've got Sue is a huge part of that as well. A lot of people here at UBC and LOA, but Sue in particular, and Kate was involved, and so on. So, but we have 23 partners or something at this point now. So it continues to grow and expand. Check it out. It's worth checking out if you're looking for access to material culture, particularly from the Coast Salish area.
Just to add one small thing, the Stolo project came to be in many ways because of the RRN and what it offered. So
the Lab of Archaeology had UBC's field school belongings that had been excavated at the Kithil site available through the RRN. The Stolo Nation had made their Kithil collections available through the RRN, but the SFU collections were still sitting in boxes on shelves and they were inaccessible. So early in the project, SFU joined the RRN, brought all of those boxes to LOA. They were all cataloged, digitized, photographed, and then put into the RRN. And then all of the belongings that had come from that site were available in one place in the RRN, and then that could be used as a tool to curate selection of those belongings to feature in the Virtual Museum project. And that was really the initial goal of that project, was to unite those disconnected fragments that had been put in different institutions because of their obligations through research, to bring them and make them accessible in that digital space again. That seemed quite powerful to me. And I think that's an exciting part of the reciprocal research and its potential to make things that had been fragmented come together again.
I think we've got about 5 more minutes until lunch. So are there any last questions, comments? Okay, I have a question for you then. So much of the work we end up doing in communities is project-based, so set funding for a set period of time. And I was wondering if in that funding, whoever's funding you actually recognizes that it takes time to develop those protocols or recognize those protocols and develop those agreements and develop those relationships, or is that something that you just have to sort of force into the time you have? Or
I can just speak to that. Yeah, as the director for this SRMC, run into this all the time. You know, I've sort of been involved as a director, co-director, whatever, for, you know, quite a long time, trying to look at the model of financing for all of these operations. So that includes across the board archaeology and cultural heritage management. We've got fisheries, we've got language, we've got education, and now we've got tourism. We've got the library and archives. You know, and we had treaty funding, we've got other kind of funding. And at one point we were entirely treaty funding dependent, and when the nation split on that, all the funding went away and we collapsed completely. It was like, okay, lesson learned here, don't be reliant on one source of funding. So we've operated on a business model, and with the intention you become business minded, diversify the foundation for your revenues coming in, and you know, we generate revenues by practicing, as I say, occupy the field, practice this stuff as consultants, effectively doing, you know, applying policy through heritage management. That's one source of income that's not government dependent at all. There's other agreements that we've established that provide funding that's still government dependent, but the BC specific agreements are another source outside of treaty. And so really it's challenging. The project funds are ultimately a small part of the funds that support what we do throughout over the course of the years, but we certainly continue to search for those, and that's important. The tourism aspect of things, again, the gift shop tourism, it all feeds into this, and it's all under the same framework and umbrella of intellectual properties and consideration of principles of sharing information and so on, but applied in these different areas like the gift shop and like tourism. But they provide for funding that comes through a business model to support overall the operations we're doing. And that, otherwise we wouldn't be able to maintain the archives of the library. It's a deficit generator, right? It puts us in the hole every year. It has to be compensated for by other folks.
Sherry, just for sharing, Val, do you mind talking a little bit more about how the UNBC agreement came
We also
together?
have to partner our funding. We work with the BC Capacity Initiative, and that was able to compensate along with the UBC grant, and we also have our stewardship, our TNG, our Tribal Council funding. So we have to partner like 3 pots of funding to keep our staff going.
Just a question for the young gentleman from Stalo there. The land use referrals, you know, like we get them like crazy in all of our 6 groups. And does your staff like charge a fee to provide the kind of information you have with the different ministries, you know, to share information to to keep that moving? Is that one way to generate own source revenue?
Absolutely, you know, and it's a huge point and piece of this whole digitization process and digital information. Again, what I was talking about and showing you was leading up to a demonstration of a system, the Stalo Connect system, which has turned everything away from paperwork, you know, in piles and piles and piles of paper and notification letters for consultation that have always been the case, piling up on everybody's desks and offices in every community, and it's impossible to deal with. We just revisualized or reformatted the way we're doing this and turned it into a completely digital process. And the Stalo Connect system is what allows us to interact with governments and our communities, and again, based on the RRN foundation of interactive software, or whatever you want to call it, sort of digital space, social media kind of foundation. That's key. All the information we have, again, the link to the Stalo Heritage Database feeds that system, allows us to overlay everything we have in a digital format with, you know, the polygons of provincial development applications. So it's been extraordinary, and we've been able to, you know, achieve an agreement with the province and bring on 16 of our Stalo First Nations as members of that group. So it's reformed a group that's almost the size of the Stalo Nation back in the 1990s. Around this one aspect of need and application of digital data through digital media in this website portal system. So it's been a huge change for us, and it's really been beneficial. And we're happy to talk more about that with anybody at any time, because that's a whole other kind of subject matter.
I think we are breaking for lunch now, so I'd like, okay, I will pass the mic over.
Well, I'd like to thank the speakers, and wow, lots of questions, lots of discussion, and it filled up the time that was available, more so than I was imagining would be the case. A little update about lunch. It is running late. It comes from off campus. So we are going to be following traditional protocol around the order in which people get up and go through the lunch lines when it's ready. So unless you need to use the washroom, I would like you to stay in the room, and please chat with each other or give feedback about the session on the poster boards, and then when the time is right and we're ready, I'll be coming back and observing the traditional protocol around the serving of food. Thanks to all the speakers. We do have gift bags for all of you. So I really appreciate you taking all these questions and handling them all so well. And for the time that you invested today, prior to today, for your preparation. You're very welcome.